The laughter rolled through Ironworks bar and grill like thunder before a storm. 5 men in tailored suits occupied the corner booth, their voices pitched loud enough to carry across the dim interior, where amber lights caught the gold of their watches and the polish of Italian leather. They leaned close over their whiskeys, confidence radiating from every gesture, every word shaped by the certainty that comes from never being told no. At the far end of the bar, Marcus Thompson sat alone. His flannel shirt bore oil stains at the elbows faded from 1,000 washes. Jeans marked with grease clung to legs that had spent the day beneath car frames. He made no effort to hide what he was. The whiskey in his hand caught the light as ice shifted amber liquid swirling in slow circles, while his eyes moved between the iPad screen and the group behind him. Brad Hutchins raised his glass toward Marcus' voice carrying across the space between them without apology. "Hey, that guy looks like he just crawled out from under a car hood." Laughter erupted from the booth. Another voice younger, more eager to impress. "Bet he's here for the cheap fries." Blake Hendricks swirled his scotch, grinning at his own cleverness. "Single dads don't build empires. They just clean up after the ones who do." Marcus didn't move. His jaw stayed relaxed, shoulders square against the worn leather of the bar stool. The words rolled past him like water off steel. He'd heard variations of the same mockery for 7 years now, ever since the flannel replaced custom suits and calloused hands replaced architectural drafting pencils. The world saw what it wanted to see. Grease under fingernails meant ignorance, meant limitation, meant a man who'd failed to reach higher. Let them think it. His attention returned to the iPad screen where a Portland Tribune article spread across the display. The headline read, "Riverview Waterfront, Portland's most ambitious project, breaks ground this fall." Below it, a rendering showed glass towers rising along the Willamette River, their reflective surfaces promising luxury living with premium river views. Marcus's brow furrowed as he scrolled to the environmental impact section. 2 paragraphs. That was all they'd allocated to soil analysis in a $450 million development. His fingers tightened around the whiskey glass. Behind him, Brad Hutchins continued holding court, oblivious or indifferent to the man he'd just mocked. Derek Warner never misses. The guy knows how to work the system, gets projects approved faster than anyone in Portland. Blake nodded, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone about to share insider knowledge. Environmental survey came back clean. Right, TriStar Engineering gave it the green light. Brad's grin widened. Clean enough. Derek knows people at TriStar. They understand how business works. Marcus set the glass down carefully, the click of crystal on wood lost beneath the booth's laughter. His eyes stayed fixed on the article on the architect's renderings that showed buildings rising where buildings should never stand. The old Cascade paper mill site. He knew that land, every contaminated inch of it. 7 years ago, he'd spent 6 months surveying that exact location for Coleman and Fisher. The report he'd authored ran 87 pages documenting heavy metal contamination, unstable soil composition, seasonal flooding patterns that undercut the riverbank. The conclusion had been unambiguous development not recommended without $15 million in remediation costs. The client had walked away. Marcus had assumed the land would stay dormant, that someone somewhere had learned the lesson about building on poison. He'd been wrong. The bartender Tony moved down the bar with practiced efficiency, refilling Marcus's glass without being asked. Late 40s, graying at the temples, the kind of man who'd seen enough to stay quiet and enough to know when to speak. "First time here," Marcus glanced up. "Yeah. Heard this place was popular with developers." Tony's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or understanding that came from watching too many deals go down in his establishment. "That's one way to put it. You in real estate?" Marcus shook his head. "No. Just curious." Tony moved on, leaving Marcus to his whiskey and his thoughts. The ice melted slowly, diluting the amber liquid, while voices from the booth continued their celebration of deals closed and profits anticipated. Marcus pulled up another browser tab searching for information on TriStar Engineering's previous projects. The results painted a clear picture. Selwood crossing foundations cracked within 3 years. The Pearl District renovation water damage from inadequate drainage systems. TriStar specialized in telling developers what they wanted to hear, minimizing risks that couldn't be minimized, cutting corners that shouldn't be cut. And now they'd cleared the Riverview site. Marcus closed his eyes, seeing the land as he remembered it. The chemical smell that rose from disturbed soil. The discoloration in groundwater samples. The way the riverbank crumbled during spring floods, revealing layers of industrial waste dumped decades before environmental regulations existed. Families would buy those condos. They'd take out 30-year mortgages, invest their savings, build their lives in towers constructed on contaminated ground. And within 5 years, maybe less, the cracks would start appearing. Doors that wouldn't close. Windows that stuck. Foundations shifting as the unstable soil beneath them continued its inevitable collapse. Children would live there. The thought settled in his chest like a stone. Around him, ironworks pulsed with its Thursday evening rhythm. Conversations rose and fell. Glasses clinked, kitchen orders rang out from the pass-through. Marcus sat at the edge of it all, invisible in his flannel and denim, a man the world had learned to overlook. He'd come here deliberately. The Tribune article had mentioned that Bennett and Warner executives celebrated the project approval at their favorite local spot, Ironworks Bar and Grill, Southeast Portland. Marcus had driven across town, left Schuyler with Mrs. Kowalski next door, and positioned himself exactly where he needed to be. Not to confront. Not yet. Just to observe, to understand who was pushing this project forward, to see if anyone involved cared enough about the truth to hear it. The door opened, bringing a gust of cool September air, and a woman who commanded attention the moment she crossed the threshold. Copper hair caught the amber light, styled with deliberate casualness that spoke of expensive salons and careful maintenance. Her blazer fit perfectly tailored to emphasize competence without sacrificing femininity. But it was her eyes that told the real story, sharp, assessing, exhausted, in a way that went deeper than a long workday. Rachel Bennett. Marcus recognized her from the Tribune article's photo, though the professional headshot hadn't captured the tension in her shoulders or the way she moved through the space like someone perpetually braced for the next crisis. Tony greeted her with familiarity. "Ms. Bennett, the usual." Her voice carried the kind of controlled warmth that came from years of managing client relationships. "Please, Tony, and make it a double. Long day." She took a seat 2 stools down from Marcus, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain professional distance. Her attention went immediately to her phone fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency, work that never stopped even after official hours ended. Marcus returned to his iPad, keeping her in his peripheral vision. The CEO of Bennett and Warner Development, co-founder with Derek Warner. According to the business profiles he'd pulled earlier, she'd built the company from nothing 7 years ago, establishing a reputation for ethical development and community integration, which made the Riverview project even more baffling. Either she didn't know what Derek was pushing through, or she'd compromised principles for profit. Marcus needed to determine which. Rachel's wine arrived, a Pinot Noir that Tony poured with the precision of someone who'd served it countless times before. She took a long sip, eyes closing briefly as tension visibly released from her frame. Then she noticed Marcus's screen, the Riverview article still displayed. Her voice cut through the ambient noise with precision. "You're reading about Riverview." Marcus looked up, meeting her gaze. Ice blue eyes that missed nothing, assessing him with the same intensity she'd probably brought to every business negotiation in her career. "Just curious about development projects." She tilted her head slightly, the gesture of someone used to extracting information from reluctant sources. "Professional interest or personal?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "Let's say concerned citizen." The corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile. Rachel Bennett didn't become a CEO by missing subtext. We don't get many concerned citizens at Ironworks, usually just developers and investors celebrating deals. She gestured toward the booth where Brad and Blake continued their increasingly loud conversation. Marcus caught Derek Warner's name again, mentioned with the kind of reverence reserved for rainmakers and miracle workers. Rachel's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Marcus took a calculated risk. The Waterton building downtown. Beautiful curved glass facade. Rachel's eyebrows rose slightly, interest sharpening. It is. Award-winning design. Marcus kept his voice neutral, conversational. Beautiful disaster. Western exposure with minimal overhang. Thermal efficiency is terrible. They had to retrofit additional cooling systems within 6 months of opening. Silence stretched between them. Rachel set her wine glass down carefully, attention now fully focused on Marcus in a way it hadn't been before. How did you know that? Marcus realized his mistake too late. The information wasn't public knowledge, wasn't something a random concerned citizen would possess. He'd revealed too much, shown too much expertise. I read a lot. Rachel's eyes narrowed, but not with suspicion, with recognition. She was seeing past the flannel now, past the grease-stained jeans and calloused hands to something underneath that didn't quite fit the image. Most people who read a lot don't know specific details about thermal efficiency retrofits. Marcus's phone vibrated before he could navigate away from the conversational trap he'd created. Mrs. Kowalski's name appeared on the screen. He glanced at the message Skylar couldn't sleep asking for him. He stood, leaving enough cash to cover his drink and Rachel's wine. I should go. Rachel reached into her bag, extracting a business card with the efficiency of someone who'd made this gesture 1,000 times. Rachel Bennett, CEO, Bennett and Warner Development. 3 phone numbers and 2 email addresses. I'm Rachel Bennett. Marcus took the card, feeling its weight, heavy stock, embossed lettering, the kind of detail that spoke to quality and permanence. Marcus Thompson. Her hand extended, grip firm without being aggressive, professional. But her eyes stayed sharp, still trying to piece together who he was and why he knew things he shouldn't. Will you be here tomorrow night, Marcus? The question held layers, an invitation. A challenge, a recognition that their conversation had been interrupted before it truly began. Marcus slipped the card into his pocket. Maybe. He walked out into the September evening, leaving Rachel Bennett to her wine and her questions. Behind him, the door closed on voices still celebrating Derek Warner's genius, still confident in projects built on foundations of deception. Marcus had made first contact. Now, he needed to decide what came next. The drive home took 15 minutes through streets that transitioned from commercial blocks to residential neighborhoods where houses sat close together, their small yards speaking to Portland's density. Oak Street welcomed him with familiar markers. Mrs. Kowalski's porch light 2 doors down, the Johnson family's minivan parked at an angle that blocked half their driveway. The maple tree that dropped leaves across his walkway every autumn. Number 942 looked exactly as it had when he'd left. Paint peeling slightly around the window frames, gutters that needed cleaning before winter rains arrived, a front door that stuck in its frame during humid weather. 7 years of mortgage payments had made it his, but the house still felt temporary, like something he was borrowing until life returned to its proper course. Skylar met him at the door before Mrs. Kowalski could rise from the living room couch. 10 years old, dark hair falling across her face, wearing pajamas covered in cartoon characters she pretended not to like anymore. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Mrs. Kowalski gathered her knitting movements slow with arthritis and age. She had a nightmare. Wouldn't tell me what about, just kept asking when you'd be home. Marcus thanked her, walked her the 2 houses down to her own door, waited until she was safely inside before returning to where Skylar stood in the hallway, small and vulnerable in a way that made his chest tighten. Bad dream. Skylar shook her head, but tears were already forming. Emma Richardson says you're not really smart. She says if you were smart, you wouldn't fix cars. Marcus knelt, bringing himself to her eye level. This wasn't about nightmares. This was about the slow, grinding damage that came from being different, from not fitting the mold of what 10-year-olds in expensive Portland suburbs thought normal looked like. "What do you think?" Skylar's voice came out small. "I think you're the smartest person I know, but Emma's dad is a developer and they have a big house and she gets new clothes and I just want people to stop laughing at us." The words hit harder than any mockery from Brad Hutchins ever could. Marcus pulled her close, feeling the weight of every choice he'd made 7 years ago. Choosing her over career, choosing presence over prestige, choosing a life of honest work over the architectural dreams that had once defined him. He didn't regret it, but watching his daughter hurt because of those choices carved something hollow in his chest. People will judge you by what they see, but you know who you are. That's what matters. Skylar pulled back, looking at him with eyes too old for 10. "But Dad, were you really an architect? Why did you stop?" 7 years. 7 years of deflecting this question, of giving partial answers, of protecting her from truths he thought she was too young to understand. But she was asking directly, now demanding honesty he could no longer avoid. Marcus led her to the couch, the same worn leather where he'd sat the night Lauren left, where he'd held a 3-year-old Skylar and promised her that everything would be okay, even as his world collapsed around them. "Yes, I was. I designed buildings, important ones. I worked for a big firm, had an office downtown, made good money." Skylar leaned against him, listening with the intensity she brought to everything that mattered. "But when your mom left, I had to choose, and I chose you. I'd make that choice again 1,000 times." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "But don't you miss it?" Marcus thought about the drafting table in the spare room, covered with a sheet but never thrown away. About the late nights scrolling through Architecture Now forums under the username Foundation/First, contributing analyses he'd never claim credit for. About the way his hands sometimes moved across blank paper, sketching buildings that would never be built. Every day, but I don't regret it. Skylar was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she looked up at him with sudden intensity. "Dad, if you were really good at it, why don't you prove it to everyone?" The question hung in the air between them, simple in the way only children's questions could be. Why hide? Why accept mockery? Why let the world think less of him than he was? Marcus didn't have an answer she'd understand. He tucked her back into bed, waited until her breathing evened into sleep, then stood in the doorway watching the rise and fall of her chest. She deserved better than secondhand clothes and mockery from kids whose parents confused money with worth. She deserved a father who didn't have to choose between being present and being successful, but that wasn't the world they lived in. Marcus moved to the kitchen, made coffee he didn't need, stood at the window looking out at the darkened street. Rachel Bennett's business card rested on the counter where he'd emptied his pockets. Heavy stock professional, the kind of card that opened doors. He could walk away, let the Riverview project proceed, let families discover the truth 5 years from now when their foundations started cracking. Not his responsibility, not his problem, except it was, because he knew, and knowing meant choosing. Marcus pulled out his phone, composed a text to Frank Sullivan, his boss at the garage. "Need to talk tomorrow. Important." The response came within seconds. Frank never slept much, insomnia earned during nights in the Kuwaiti desert 35 years ago. "Shop at 7. Coffee's on." Marcus poured his untouched coffee down the drain and headed to bed. Tomorrow would require clarity he didn't currently possess. Tomorrow he'd have to decide if silence was wisdom or cowardice. Sullivan's Auto Repair occupied a corner lot on Southeast 82nd Avenue, wedged between a Vietnamese pho restaurant and a check cashing store. The sign had faded from too many Portland winters, the paint cracking, but still legible enough to draw the steady stream of customers who valued honest work over flashy marketing. Frank Sullivan had owned the place for 40 years, building a reputation, one repaired transmission at a time. Marcus arrived at 6:50, finding Frank already in the bay with a Subaru Forester on the lift. Early 70s now, but still moving with the efficiency that came from muscle memory, older than most of his tools. Gray hair cropped military short shoulders that had carried equipment through desert campaigns but now bore the slight stoop of age. Frank didn't look up from the undercarriage. "Coffee in the office. Make it strong." Marcus poured 2 cups, both black, both strong enough to strip paint. He'd learned not to bother with cream or sugar around Frank, who believed coffee should taste like coffee, and anything else was an apology. They worked in comfortable silence for the first hour. Marcus tackled an oil change on a Honda Civic, then moved to a brake job that required bleeding the lines. The familiar rhythm settled his mind: diagnose, disassemble, repair, reassemble, test. Mechanical problems had clear solutions. You identified what was broken, understood why it failed, made it stronger. Frank finally spoke around 8:30, lowering the Subaru with a pneumatic hiss. "You're distracted." Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag, leaving streaks of dark grease across red cotton. "Saw something in the news. The Riverview Development Project." Frank moved to the coffee maker, refilling both their cups without asking. "That waterfront thing. What about it?" Marcus chose his words carefully, unsure how much to reveal, how much of his past to unpack in a garage that smelled of motor oil and burnt rubber. "I worked that land 7 years ago. For Coleman and Fisher. The soil's contaminated. They're building without proper remediation." Frank leaned against the workbench, eyes sharp despite the casual posture. "And that bothers you?" Not a question. A statement. Marcus nodded. "People are going to buy those condos. Families. They'll save for years for down payments, take out 30-year mortgages. Within 5 years, their foundations will start cracking." Frank sipped his coffee, studying Marcus with the intensity that came from years of reading men in stressful situations. "You can't save the world from under a car, son. If it bothers you that much, do something about it." Marcus set his cup down, frustration bleeding into his voice. "Like what, I'm a mechanic. Nobody's going to listen." Frank's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You weren't always a mechanic. And you still aren't, not really." The words hung between them. In 7 years of working together, they'd never discussed Marcus's previous career. Frank had hired him based on aptitude tests, and a recommendation from a friend asked no questions about MIT degrees or architectural licenses, accepted the story Marcus presented without demanding the truth underneath. But Frank had always known. Marcus looked down at his hands, at the grease under his fingernails, and the calluses that came from years of manual labor. "I'm not that person anymore, Frank." Frank set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "You know what I learned in the desert during Desert Storm, when everything turned to chaos and the rules stopped making sense?" Marcus waited. "Sometimes you have to break the rules to do what's right, but you always have to do what's right whether you break rules or not." The words carried weight that went beyond their surface meaning. Frank was giving permission, offering absolution for choices Marcus hadn't yet made but was clearly considering. Marcus's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Ironworks tonight, 8 p.m. Would like to continue our conversation. Rachel Bennett." Frank glanced at the screen, then back at Marcus. "That the CEO?" Marcus nodded. "She noticed you know things you shouldn't. Smart woman. Probably already has people digging into your background." Marcus pocketed the phone. "If I give her the files from the Coleman and Fisher survey, I violate my NDA. They could sue me for everything." Frank picked up a wrench, turning it over in his hands like a worry stone. "And if you don't?" The question didn't need answering. Frank moved back to the Subaru, done with philosophy, returning to the concrete reality of brake pads and transmission fluid. You're not just a mechanic, Marcus. You never were. You just forgot for a while. Marcus spent the rest of the day working through the queue, but his mind stayed on Rachel Bennett's text. 8 p.m. at Ironworks. A continuation of a conversation that had already revealed too much. A chance to do what was right, or to walk away and let someone else carry the burden of truth. At 5:30, he headed home to shower and change, to check on Skylar, to prepare for a meeting that might destroy the careful stability he'd built over 7 years. The choice was his, and he was beginning to realize he'd already made it. Marcus returned to Ironworks at 7:45, early enough to observe without being observed. The Thursday crowd had thickened, more suits mixed with business casual, the after-work rush of Portland's professional class unwinding over craft cocktails and elevated bar food. Tony worked the bar with the same practiced efficiency, recognizing Marcus with a slight nod. Brad Hutchins and Blake Hendricks occupied the same booth as the night before, voices already elevated by whiskey and self-importance. Marcus positioned himself at the bar's end, away from the previous night's seat, angling to keep the booth in his peripheral vision. Their conversation carried across the room without effort. Brad raised his glass in mock toast. To Derek Warner, who gets more done in 8 months than most developers manage in 2 years. Blake matched the gesture, ice clinking against crystal. Environmental survey came back clean, didn't it? Brad's grin held the smugness of insider knowledge. Clean enough. Derek has connections at TriStar Engineering. They understand how to work with the city, how to present data in ways that move projects forward. Marcus's jaw tightened. They weren't even pretending. The corruption was casual, discussed openly in a public bar, because men like Brad Hutchins existed in a world where consequences only applied to others. Fast-tracked the whole thing. 600 units, 450 million. Groundbreaking in 2 weeks. Blake leaned forward, lowering his voice just slightly. Pre-sales are already through the roof. People buying sight unseen based on the renderings alone. Marcus pulled out his iPad, navigating to the files he'd been reviewing for days. The Coleman and Fisher survey from 2017, 87 pages documenting contamination that should have prevented any development. He'd copied it before leaving the firm, a violation of his non-disclosure agreement insurance against the day he'd known would eventually come. That day was here. Rachel Bennett arrived at precisely 8 p.m. punctual, in a way that spoke to discipline and respect for other people's time. She'd changed from yesterday's blazer to something slightly less formal, though still unmistakably professional. Her eyes scanned the room, finding Marcus immediately reading his position and body language with the assessment of someone trained to extract maximum information from minimal data. She took the stool beside him, close enough for private conversation. "You came back." Marcus met her gaze. "I said maybe." Her mouth curved slightly, appreciation for the deflection. "I had my assistant look you up, Marcus Thompson. Nothing came up professionally. It's like you don't exist in the business world." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "I exist, just not where you were looking." Rachel ordered her wine, then turned her full attention to Marcus. When Rachel Bennett focused on something, she committed completely. Marcus felt the weight of that attention, now the way she studied him like a puzzle requiring solution. "You knew about the Waterton building's thermal efficiency problems. That's not public information. That's the kind of detail only architects or engineers would possess." Marcus didn't confirm or deny, letting the silence stretch. Rachel leaned closer, voice dropping to ensure privacy. "I don't believe in coincidence. You show up here reading about Riverview, demonstrating knowledge that suggests architectural background, asking pointed questions. So I'll ask directly, who are you and what do you want?" Before Marcus could answer, Brad Hutchins's voice cut through the ambient noise, loud enough to ensure maximum audience. "Derek said the TriStar survey was clean. That's good enough for anyone with money to invest." Blake's response carried equal confidence. "Environmental surveys are just box checking anyway. Nobody actually expects problems." Something broke inside Marcus, the careful control he'd maintained for 7 years, cracking under the weight of casual disregard for human safety. His voice came out louder than intended, pitched to carry across the distance between bar and booth. Tristar Engineering. They gave the green light to the Selwood project. 3 years later, foundations cracked across the entire development. Silence rippled outward from his words. Brad Hutchins turned face flushing with alcohol and annoyance. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus stood turning to face them directly. Rachel remained on her stool, watching with intensity that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Someone who knows that land." Blake Hendricks set his drink down carefully. "Knows what exactly?" Skylar's question echoed in his mind. "If you were really good at it, why don't you prove it to everyone?" Time to prove it. That land is the old Cascade paper mill site. Operated from 1920 to 1998. They dumped industrial chemicals for decades. The groundwater's contaminated. Seasonal flooding undercuts the riverbank. The soil's unstable. Brad stood now, face darkening. Derek's team did a full environmental survey. Marcus's voice stayed level calm, backed by certainty that came from 6 months of first-hand research. Did they test core samples at 20-foot intervals? Did they map the groundwater flow patterns? Did they check for heavy metal contamination below the surface layer? Brad's mouth opened-closed. He didn't know. None of them did. They'd accepted TriStar's report because it told them what they wanted to hear. Blake tried to recover ground. "Who are you, some kind of expert?" Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I worked that land 7 years ago for Coleman and Fisher. We recommended against development without $15 million in remediation. The project was canceled." The bar had gone quiet, conversations stopping, as people tuned into drama unfolding at their periphery. Tony stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with mechanical precision while tracking every word. Rachel Bennett's expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught the slight widening of her eyes, the minute shift in posture that spoke to genuine surprise. She hadn't known. Whatever Derek Warner was pushing, he'd kept his partner in the dark about the site's history. The door opened. Derek Warner stepped into Ironworks with the confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. Mid-40s, perfectly tailored suit, expensive watch catching the light. Handsome in the way successful men often were, features sharpened by ambition and regular gym sessions. His presence commanded attention without effort. He caught the tail end of Marcus's statement, heard the words Coleman and Fisher, saw the way Brad and Blake had gone silent. Derek's eyes moved from the booth to Marcus, assessing, calculating, adjusting strategy in real time. He approached with measured steps, smile perfectly calibrated between friendly and professional. "Did I just hear you say you worked for Coleman and Fisher?" Marcus turned to face this new variable, this man whose decisions would affect hundreds of families. 7 years ago. Derek's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "And you're claiming our environmental survey is wrong." Marcus chose his words with precision. "I'm saying it's incomplete." Derek glanced at Rachel, some silent communication passing between partners who'd worked together long enough to read subtle signals. Then back to Marcus, reassessing, recalibrating his approach. "Mr. Thompson, is it you're making serious accusations about a $450 million project?" Marcus didn't respond, letting Derek fill the silence. "Based on a survey from 7 years ago, technology has improved. TriStar used the latest equipment, the most advanced testing protocols." Rachel's attention felt sharp as a blade watching this exchange, processing implications that went far beyond surface conversation. TriStar has a reputation for optimistic results. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's slander. TriStar is a licensed, respected firm." Rachel finally spoke, voice cutting through the tension with authority. "Derek, maybe we should hear him out." Derek turned to her, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. Irritation flashed across his features before the professional smile reasserted itself. "Rachel, this is a random mechanic trying to—" Marcus interrupted, voice quiet but carrying. "How did you know I'm a mechanic?" Derek froze, caught. His pause lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. "I assumed based on your appearance." The lie hung in the air, obvious to everyone paying attention. Derek had known who Marcus was before entering, which meant he'd been tracking the situation, monitoring threats to his project. Marcus stood facing Derek directly across 3 feet of polished wood floor. The Cascade paper mill used hexavalent chromium in its processing. It's carcinogenic. It seeps into groundwater and doesn't degrade. If you're building residential units without testing for that specific compound, you're putting families at risk. Absolute silence. Derek's professional mask cracked, further anger bleeding through. "Unless you have actual documentation, you're just spreading paranoid rumors that could damage." Marcus pulled out his phone, navigating to the encrypted folder where he'd stored scanned copies of the Coleman and Fisher survey. 87 pages of soil samples, groundwater analysis, contamination mapping. Evidence that would destroy Derek's project and potentially destroy Marcus's life. Rachel stood moving beside Marcus, looking at the screen. "You have documentation." Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that had built her reputation. Marcus met her eyes, saw the intelligence there, the hunger for truth that existed beneath corporate polish. "It's complicated." Derek stepped forward, voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Those files are stolen property. If you obtained them illegally—" Rachel cut him off with a gesture. "Derek, can we speak outside?" "It wasn't a request." Derek's expression went through rapid transformations, anger, calculation, forced calm. He looked at Marcus with undisguised hostility. "This conversation isn't over." He turned, walking toward the door with rigid shoulders. Rachel followed but paused beside Marcus, voice low enough that only he could hear. "Tomorrow, my office, 2 p.m. She handed him a different card, this one with her private cell number written on the back in precise script. "If lives are at risk, you need to share what you know." Then she was gone, following Derek into the parking lot, leaving Marcus standing at the bar with Tony watching silently and Brad Hutchins staring with an expression somewhere between shock and calculation. Marcus sat back down, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. He'd done it. Broken 7 years of silence, stepped back into a world he'd left behind, made himself a target. No going back now. Tony refilled his whiskey without comment, professional enough to recognize when a man needed a drink and silence more than conversation. Marcus pulled out his phone, looking at the encrypted files that could save families or destroy his own. The choice had seemed clear in the abstract, but sitting here with the weight of consequences settling over him, clarity felt distant. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Thompson, we represent Coleman and Fisher. Please contact us immediately regarding potential breach of contract." They'd already mobilized their lawyers. Marcus stared at the message, at the threat implicit in corporate language, at the machinery of legal consequences beginning to turn. Behind him, Brad and Blake had resumed their conversation in hushed tones. The show was over for now, but word would spread. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Portland's development community would know that someone was questioning the Riverview project. Marcus finished his whiskey, left cash on the bar, and walked out into the cool September night. The city stretched around him, towers rising against the darkening sky, built on foundations both literal and metaphorical. Some would stand for generations. Others would crumble under weight they were never designed to bear. He knew which category Riverview belonged to. Now he had to decide if knowing was enough or if he'd follow through on the path he'd started walking tonight. The drive home took him through streets transformed by darkness, familiar landmarks rendered strange by shadow. Oak Street welcomed him back with the same peeling paint and overgrown lawn, physical evidence of a life built on modest income and careful priorities. Inside, Mrs. Kowalski had fallen asleep on the couch, knitting, abandoned in her lap. Marcus woke her gently, walked her home, returned to find Skylar still asleep in her room. dark hair spread across the pillow, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 3. Marcus stood in the doorway watching her breathe, thinking about the families who would buy Riverview condos without knowing what lay beneath their foundation. He thought about Emma Richardson and her mockery about Skylar's question, "Why don't you prove it to everyone?" He thought about Frank Sullivan's words, "You're not just a mechanic. You never were. You just forgot for a while." Most of all, he thought about Rachel Bennett's card in his pocket and the meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. tomorrow. A meeting that would determine whether he'd spent 7 years running from his past or preparing to face it. Marcus moved to the spare room to the drafting table covered with a sheet and pulled the fabric away. Beneath it, architectural tools lay arranged with the precision of someone who'd never truly let go. T-square triangles, pencils sharpened to perfect points. He sat, pulled out paper, and began to sketch. Not buildings for clients, not designs for profit, but the truth of what lay beneath the Riverview site, rendered in clean lines and precise annotations. A map of contamination that families deserved to see before they signed 30-year mortgages on homes built over poison. The pencil moved across paper muscle memory, returning after 7 years of dormancy, and Marcus Thompson began the journey back to who he'd been before the world forced him to choose between being present and being successful. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be both. Morning arrived with the weight of decisions already made. Marcus woke at 5:15, 15 minutes before the alarm, mind already processing the meeting ahead. The lawsuit threat from Coleman and Fisher sat on his phone like a ticking clock each hour, bringing closer the moment when corporate lawyers would transform threat into action. He went through the morning routine with mechanical precision. Coffee brewed while he assembled Skylar's lunch, the ritual unchanged by the earthquake building beneath his carefully constructed life. Sandwich cut into triangles, apple sliced, a note tucked inside. "You got this, Sky," written in the same hand that had once drafted award-winning architectural plans. Skylar emerged from her room with sleep-tousled hair, eyes still carrying yesterday's hurt. She sat at the kitchen table picking at her breakfast, and Marcus recognized the signs. Whatever Emma Richardson had said, whatever damage had been inflicted, it hadn't healed overnight. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Marcus poured orange juice, keeping his movement steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "Always." Skylar's fingers traced patterns on the tablecloth, not meeting his eyes. "If you tell people the truth about the buildings, will they listen?" The question cut deeper than she knew. Marcus set the juice carton down, considering how to answer honestly without burdening her with adult complications. "Some will, some won't, but telling the truth isn't about whether people listen. It's about whether you can live with staying silent." Skylar looked up, then her expression carrying understanding beyond her years. "Like how I should have told the teacher when Emma was mean, instead of just being sad." Pride mixed with the ache of watching his daughter navigate a world that rarely rewarded honesty. Exactly like that. The drive to Bridgeport Elementary revealed autumn advancing through Portland's trees, leaves shifting from green to gold. Marcus watched other parents drop off their children, expensive SUVs and luxury sedans creating a gauntlet of wealth that Skylar walked through daily. His Ford F-150 looked exactly like what it was, a working man's truck, functional rather than impressive. Skylar hesitated before opening the door, fingers on the handle. "Dad, when you talk to those people today, don't let them make you feel small." The words landed with unexpected force. Marcus reached over, squeezed her shoulder. "Never, Sky. They can't make me anything I'm not." She smiled, then small, but genuine, and climbed out. Marcus waited until she disappeared through the school doors before pulling away, her advice echoing in his mind. "Don't let them make you feel small." Sullivan's Auto Repair greeted him with familiar smells. Motor oil, brake fluid, the metallic tang of worked metal. Frank was already there, as always, bent over a Toyota Camry's engine bay, with the focused intensity that age hadn't diminished. Marcus grabbed his coveralls, zipping into the second skin that had defined him for 7 years. But today the fabric felt different, like a costume he was preparing to shed. They worked in silence until mid-morning when the rush of early customers thinned. Frank lowered himself onto a rolling stool joints, protesting decades of hard use, and studied Marcus with eyes that missed nothing. "You're going to do it." Not a question. Frank had already read the decision in Marcus's posture, in the way he'd moved through morning repairs with distracted precision. Marcus set down the wrench he'd been holding. "I have to. Can't sleep knowing what I know and doing nothing about it." Frank nodded slowly, pulling a pack of small cigars from his shirt pocket. He didn't light one, just rolled it between his fingers like a talisman. "The files you kept, they'll sue you for that." Marcus had already run the calculations, tallied the potential costs. His savings would cover maybe 3 months of legal fees. After that, he'd lose the house, lose everything he'd built. "Probably. Rachel Bennett said she'd protect me, but I don't know if that's a promise she can keep." Frank's expression hardened into something that belonged to younger years, to desert nights, when promises meant survival. "You know what got me through Kuwait, through nights when everything turned to chaos and the rules stopped meaning anything?" Marcus waited, knowing that some things matter more than the rules. Some things you do because they're right, even when right gets you killed. The cigar continued its rotation between weathered fingers. "Desert Storm taught me that breaking the law to do what's moral isn't the same as breaking the law to do what's easy. You break it for the right reasons, you accept the consequences without complaining." The weight of that wisdom settled into Marcus's bones, finding space next to Skylar's advice and Rachel Bennett's card, and 7 years of building a life on foundations of honest work. "I could lose everything, Frank. The house, Skylar's college fund, any chance of working in architecture again." Frank finally looked up, and his eyes held the kind of certainty that came from watching men choose between safety and principle. "You already lost architecture when you chose Skylar. This isn't about getting it back. This is about whether you're the kind of man who can live with himself, or the kind who spends the rest of his life wondering if he could have saved someone." Frank stood, joints creaking. "Whatever you decide, the job's here. I didn't hire you because you were an architect pretending to be a mechanic. I hired you because you're good with your hands and you show up when you say you will." He moved back to the Camry conversation, concluded in the way Frank preferred, direct, honest, finished. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Rachel Bennett's private number. "Moved our meeting to 10 a.m. Derek called emergency session with board. Need your files before then." The timeline had accelerated. Whatever Derek was planning, he was moving fast to contain the damage Marcus had inflicted last night. Marcus typed a response. "I'll be there." Frank glanced over, reading something in Marcus's posture. "Go. I'll cover your shift." Marcus stripped off the coveralls, hung them on their designated hook, and walked to his truck. The USB drive containing the Coleman and Fisher files sat in his glove compartment, insurance-turned weapon. He'd kept it for 7 years, always knowing this day might come, but hoping it never would. Hope had run out. The drive downtown took him through Portland's transformation from residential neighborhoods to commercial districts. Bennett and Warner Development occupied the 18th floor of a glass tower that reflected the city back at itself. All gleaming surfaces and architectural ambition. Marcus had been in buildings like this before, back when he'd worn suits and attended meetings that shaped skylines. The marble lobby, the efficient elevators, the polished professionalism of corporate spaces, all familiar in ways that made the intervening years feel both vast and insignificant. The elevator delivered him to reception, where a young woman with perfect makeup and practiced smile directed him to wait. Marcus sat in chairs designed to impress, rather than comfort, surrounded by architectural awards and magazine covers featuring Rachel Bennett alongside various mayors and city officials. She'd built something impressive. The question was whether she'd built it honestly, or whether Derek Warner's shortcuts had compromised everything she'd worked for. Rachel appeared at precisely 9:55 punctuality, apparently a core value. She'd traded yesterday's business casual for full armor-tailored suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back in a style that meant business. But her eyes carried shadows that makeup couldn't quite hide, evidence of a night spent processing unwelcome truths. "Marcus, thank you for coming early." She led him through open-plan workspace where architects hunched over drafting tables and computers, their focus absolute. Marcus recognized the atmosphere, deadline pressure, the weight of projects requiring perfection. Creative minds bent toward practical solutions. Rachel's office occupied the corner, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Willamette River and the city sprawling beyond. Awards lined one wall, architectural renderings another. A drafting table sat near the window, covered with papers marked in red ink corrections, revisions, the never-ending refinement that characterized quality work. Rachel closed the door and the professional mask cracked slightly. "Derek's calling the board together at 2 p.m. He's claiming you're a disgruntled former employee trying to sabotage our project with fabricated evidence." Marcus absorbed this, unsurprised by the counterattack. "I was never employed by Bennett and Warner. Hard to be disgruntled about a job I never had." Rachel moved to her desk but didn't sit. Energy radiated from her, the kind that came from sleepless nights and decisions that kept getting harder. "He's already contacted Coleman and Fisher. They confirmed you worked there, confirmed there was a survey, confirmed you signed an NDA." She finally met his eyes directly. "He's setting you up. If you give me those files, he'll use the NDA violation to destroy your credibility and possibly put you in jail." Marcus pulled the USB drive from his pocket, holding it between them like evidence at trial. "I know what I'm risking." Rachel stared at the drive and something shifted in her expression. Not calculation, recognition. She was seeing him clearly now, past the flannel and calluses, understanding the choice he was making and what it would cost. "I had my team dig into your background last night. Marcus Thompson, MIT Master of Architecture, graduated top of your class. Coleman and Fisher hired you straight out of school. 6 years there, multiple awards, reputation for thoroughness bordering on obsessive." She moved closer, voice dropping. "Then nothing. You vanished from the profession. No forwarding address in the industry. No LinkedIn. No professional presence. Until last night when you showed up in a flannel shirt, knowing things only an architect would know." Marcus kept his expression neutral, offering no explanations she hadn't earned. Rachel's next words came slower, weighted with understanding. "Your daughter. She was born 8 years into your career. Your wife left a year later, and you walked away from everything to raise her alone." The research had been thorough. Marcus felt exposed in ways that went beyond professional vulnerability. "Sophie Schuyler, now you call her Sky, she's 10. Which means you've been doing this for 7 years, choosing her over everything else." Rachel's voice held something Marcus hadn't expected. Not pity, respect. "I built this company on doing things right. My father was a contractor who died because another contractor cut corners on scaffolding to save $300. I swore I'd never compromise safety for profit." She moved to the window, looking out at the city she'd helped shape. "But Derek's been my partner for 7 years. He helped me start Bennett and Warner when no one else would back a woman CEO. I owe him everything." Marcus heard the conflict beneath her words, loyalty warring with principles. "Yesterday I found emails between Derek and Tristar Engineering. He paid them $50,000 for an expedited survey, specifically asked them to minimize red flags." She turned back, and her eyes held the kind of anger that came from betrayal. "I've suspected for weeks that something was wrong with Riverview, but I couldn't fire Derek without proof. He owns 50% of the company. If I move against him without cause, he can sue me into oblivion." Marcus began understanding the chess game being played. "You need my files not to verify the contamination. You already believe it's there. You need them to justify removing Derek." Rachel's silence confirmed it. Marcus set the USB drive on her desk. I copied these files before leaving Coleman and Fisher. It was a violation of my non-disclosure agreement, legally indefensible, and I did it because I knew someone would eventually try to build there. Rachel picked up the drive, turning it over in her hands. If this goes public, they'll sue you. The NDA violation alone could cost you millions in damages. Marcus had run these numbers, knew the consequences. Then I need you to promise something. If Coleman and Fisher comes after me, you cover my legal fees. All of them. Until this is resolved. Rachel met his eyes. And in exchange, Marcus moved to the window, looking down at the city 18 floors below. I want complete anonymity. No press, no marketing using my name or credentials. I'll consult on the remediation, but I don't join your company. I stay at Sullivan's. I stay present for Skylar. Rachel considered this, calculating. You're asking me to protect you legally while you remain professionally invisible. That's not how this usually works. Marcus turned back to face her. I'm asking you to let me do the right thing without losing my daughter in the process. 7 years ago, I chose her over my career. I'm not reversing that choice now. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the muted sounds of the city below. Rachel studied him with an intensity that felt like judgment and assessment combined. Finally, she extended her hand. Deal. But I need one more thing. Marcus waited. When the board meets this afternoon, I need you there. Derek will attack your credibility. You'll need to defend it face to face. Marcus thought about Skylar, about the promise to pick her up from school, about the careful routine that kept their lives stable. I'll be there. Rachel's grip remained firm. Thank you. For caring enough to break your silence. For risking everything to do what's right. Marcus extracted his hand, uncomfortable with gratitude he didn't feel he'd earned. I haven't done anything yet except give you a USB drive. The hard part comes when Derek realizes you're not backing down. As if summoned by his name, Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, expression darkening. Derek. He wants to meet before the board session. Marcus moved toward the door. I should go. Let you handle that. Rachel's voice stopped him. Marcus, be careful. Derek's desperate, and desperate men do dangerous things. The warning carried weight that suggested Rachel knew her partner better than Marcus did. He nodded, left her office, navigated back through the workspace to the elevators. The descent felt faster than the ascent, 18 floors dropping away, until he emerged into the parking garage's concrete embrace. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows between support columns. Marcus's truck sat in visitor parking, isolated from the luxury vehicles that populated the reserved spaces. He was halfway there when Derek Warner stepped from behind a concrete pillar. The transformation from last night's professional veneer was striking. Derek's tie hung loose, jacket, abandoned shirt, wrinkled in ways that suggested he'd worn it too long without rest. His eyes held the kind of desperation that made Marcus's instincts flare, warning. Mr. Thompson, we need to talk. Marcus kept walking, keys in hand, measuring distances. I don't think we have anything to discuss. Derek moved to block the path to Marcus's truck, not threatening, but deliberate. I saw you leave Rachel's office. I know what you gave her. Marcus stopped, evaluating. Derek looked worse than desperate. He looked broken, like a man watching everything he'd built collapse in real time. You violated your NDA with Coleman and Fisher. Do you know what happens when you do that? Derek's voice carried the edge of someone who'd researched the answer thoroughly. They can sue you for damages. Could be millions. You can't afford a lawsuit, Marcus. Single father, $45,000 a year, mortgage payments you barely make. The fact that Derek knew his salary, knew his financial situation, sent cold clarity through Marcus's system. You had me investigated. Derek's expression held no apology. Of course I did. The moment you opened your mouth at Ironworks, I needed to know who you were and what ammunition you had. He stepped closer. and Marcus saw the tremor in his hands, the slight shake that suggested too much coffee and not enough sleep. I'm offering you $50,000, cash, untraceable. You tell Rachel those files are fabricated old data that's no longer relevant and you walk away. $50,000 for doing nothing. Anger built in Marcus's chest, cold and controlled. You're trying to bribe me. Derek's laugh came out bitter. I'm offering you a way out. Take the money. Keep your house. Keep your daughter's college fund intact. Go back to being a mechanic and let the adults handle business. Marcus's hands clenched, but his voice stayed level. No. Derek's mask cracked further, revealing something raw underneath. Please, I'm begging you. I need this project. My wife is sick. Multiple sclerosis. Her medications cost $40,000 a year. I'm sick. Prostate cancer, stage 2. Treatment's expensive, and I need the signing bonus from Riverview to afford it. The confession hit like a physical blow. Derek transformed before Marcus's eyes, not a villain, but a man drowning, making choices born from desperation rather than malice. I'm sorry about your wife, about your cancer, but I can't let you build on contaminated land. Derek's composure shattered completely. Tears formed, spilling down cheeks that hadn't seen emotion in too long. Then you're sentencing me to death. Do you understand that without this project, I can't afford treatment? I'll be dead in 2 years. The weight of that statement settled over the parking garage like concrete dust. One life balanced against hundreds of families. Impossible calculus that had no right answer. I'm truly sorry. But your life doesn't justify putting children at risk. Derek's expression transformed grief, replaced by cold rage. Then you're a fool. And you'll regret this. He turned, walking away with shoulders rigid, leaving Marcus standing in the parking garage with the echo of threats and the burden of a dying man's desperation. Marcus climbed into his truck, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. Derek's revelation had complicated everything. This wasn't simple corruption. It was a man trying to survive, making morally bankrupt choices because all the good options had already disappeared. Understanding didn't change the math. Families would still live in unsafe housing. Children would still grow up in homes built on poison. But it made the fight feel different, heavier, weighted with the knowledge that doing the right thing would cost Derek Warner his life. Marcus drove back to Sullivan's mind, processing layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated. Frank looked up from an engine rebuild, read Marcus's expression, asked no questions. They worked through lunch, Marcus losing himself in the familiar rhythm of diagnosis and repair. Mechanical problems had clear solutions. Human problems spiraled into moral labyrinths where every choice carried consequences that rippled outward in ways impossible to predict. At 1:30, Marcus cleaned up, changed into the cleanest clothes he had, slacks and a button-down shirt that had spent 7 years waiting for an occasion that required them. Frank watched him transform, understanding what the meeting meant. Remember what I said. You break the rules for the right reasons, you accept the consequences. Marcus nodded, climbed back into his truck, and drove to a confrontation that would determine whether 7 years of silence had been wisdom or cowardice. The board meeting convened at 2 p.m. in Bennett and Warner's main conference room. Marcus arrived early, finding Rachel already there, surrounded by 3 other people who carried themselves with the authority that came from controlling significant capital. Rachel made introductions with professional efficiency. John Hastings, our primary investor. Victoria Hayes, CFO. David Greenberg, legal counsel. Marcus shook hands, reading assessment in their eyes. They saw the flannel shirt he'd changed into slacks, the calluses that no amount of soap could erase, the 7 years of manual labor that had reshaped him into something their world no longer recognized. John Hastings, early 60s, with silver hair and expensive suit, studied Marcus with open skepticism. Mr. Thompson, Rachel tells us you have concerns about the Riverview project. Before Marcus could respond, Derek Warner entered, flanked by two men Marcus didn't recognize. Derek had recovered his professional demeanor suit, fresh expression, carefully neutral. But his eyes, when they found Marcus, held undisguised hostility. Thank you all for coming on short notice. I called this meeting because someone is attempting to sabotage our project with fabricated evidence and slander. He gestured toward Marcus like a prosecutor identifying the defendant. Mr. Thompson here claims to have documentation showing Riverview is unsafe, but he obtained those files illegally in violation of his non-disclosure agreement with Coleman and Fisher. Victoria Hayes, late 50s, with sharp eyes and sharper suit, leaned forward. Is this true, Mr. Thompson? Did you violate your NDA? Marcus met her gaze without flinching. Yes. I copied the files before leaving Coleman and Fisher 7 years ago because I knew someone would eventually try to develop that land. I kept them for exactly this situation. Derek pounced on the admission. So you admit to stealing confidential documents, which means anything you present is legally inadmissible and professionally unethical. David Greenberg, the lawyer, adjusted his glasses. Mr. Warner has a point. If the files were obtained through NDA violation, their use in any official capacity creates liability issues for everyone involved. Rachel's voice cut through the mounting tension. Unless we conduct an independent survey, a third-party assessment that either confirms or denies Marcus's findings. Derek's jaw tightened. That would take months. We'd lose pre-sales. Investors would walk. The entire project would collapse. Rachel didn't back down. Better than building on poison and getting sued when foundations start cracking. John Hastings raised a hand, silencing the argument. Mr. Thompson, Rachel says you're an MIT-trained architect with extensive experience in soil analysis. Can you testify to the accuracy of your findings? Marcus stood, feeling 8 pairs of eyes tracking his movement. I spent 6 months surveying the Riverview site in 2017. Every word in that report is accurate. The soil contains heavy metals from decades of industrial dumping. The groundwater is contaminated. Seasonal flooding undermines the riverbank. Building residential units there without extensive remediation will result in structural failure within 5 years. Derek stood as well, face flushing. He's a mechanic. Why are we listening to a mechanic instead of licensed engineers with current certifications? Victoria Hayes's voice carried quiet authority. Because he's not just a mechanic, is he Derek MIT, Master of Architecture, 6 years at Coleman and Fisher, multiple industry awards. His credentials are stronger than most of our consulting team. Derek's composure cracked. His credentials are 7 years old. He walked away from architecture. People who succeed don't become mechanics. The words hung in the air, contempt undisguised. Marcus felt their weight but refused to let them land. I became a mechanic because my daughter needed a father who was present, not a father who worked 80-hour weeks chasing recognition. I don't regret that choice. Silence settled over the conference room. Victoria Hayes studied Marcus with new interest, seeing past professional credentials to the choice underneath. Derek tried a different approach, desperation bleeding into his voice. Even if his survey was accurate 7 years ago, conditions change. TriStar used the latest equipment, the most advanced testing protocols. Rachel pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. TriStar's report. 2 pages on soil contamination. 0 mention of hexavalent chromium testing. No groundwater flow mapping. No analysis of seasonal flooding patterns. She looked at Derek with an expression that mixed betrayal and determination. I also found emails showing you paid them $50,000 for expedited service, with explicit instructions to minimize environmental red flags. Derek went pale. That's a private email. You had no right. Rachel's voice turned to ice. I have every right to access company communications when I suspect fraud. And what you did, Derek, putting families at risk to expedite a project that's fraud. The room erupted in controlled chaos. John Hastings demanded to see the emails. David Greenberg started discussing legal implications. Victoria Hayes pulled out her phone, already calculating financial exposure. Through it all, Derek stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed defense collapse. Rachel's voice cut through the noise, sharp enough to silence everyone. My father died because someone valued $300 over human life. I will not let this company become the reason someone else's father dies. We halt. We verify. We do it right, or we don't do it at all. The room went silent. Even Derek stopped moving, recognizing finality when he heard it. Then he did something Marcus didn't expect. Derek's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. When he spoke, his voice came out broken. I'm dying, Rachel. Prostate cancer stage 2. My wife has MS. We need $400,000 a year for treatment and medications. The signing bonus from Riverview was $2 million. It would have bought us 5 years. The room went silent again, but this time the quality of silence changed. No longer judgment. Something closer to grief. Derek looked at Marcus. I knew the soil had issues. I knew Tristar was cutting corners. But I thought we could fix it later after we had the funding. I thought I could save my life and still do right by the buyers. Rachel's voice gentled, despite the anger still visible in her posture. Derek, why didn't you tell me we could have found another way? Derek's laugh came out hollow. Because I'm supposed to be your partner, not your charity case. Because I built this company with you and I didn't want to be the weak link that brought it down. John Hastings cleared his throat, bringing the meeting back to business. This is a difficult situation, but we need to make a decision. Do we proceed with Riverview or do we halt construction pending independent verification? Victoria Hayes spoke before anyone else could. We halt. The liability of proceeding without proper due diligence is catastrophic. If families get hurt because we ignored warnings, we're looking at lawsuits that could bankrupt the company. Derek's expression crumpled. That's my death sentence. You understand that without the signing bonus, I can't afford treatment. Rachel stood, moving around the table to stand beside Derek. The board will approve a medical assistance package. We'll cover your treatment costs. But we can't sacrifice hundreds of families to save one person. Derek looked at her, tears forming again. I don't deserve that. Not after what I did. Rachel's voice held both firmness and compassion. You don't. But I'm not going to let you die because you made desperate choices in an impossible situation. The board voted. 6-2 in favor of halting construction pending independent survey. Derek abstained, too broken to participate. As the meeting dissolved, Marcus found himself standing in the hallway outside the conference room, processing what had just happened. He'd expected a fight, anticipated Derek's attacks on his credibility. He hadn't anticipated the revelation of terminal illness, hadn't expected the confrontation to become a referendum on competing moralities. Rachel emerged looking exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Thank you for having the courage to speak up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Marcus didn't feel courageous. He felt like someone who'd just watched a man sentenced to death for trying to survive. What happens to Derek now? Rachel's expression hardened slightly. The board will require his resignation. We'll buy out his shares, structure it to cover his medical costs. But he can't stay. What he did, paying Tristar to minimize findings, that's criminal. Marcus nodded, understanding the necessity while hating the outcome. And the independent survey? Rachel pulled out her phone, showing him an email. Geo-Pacific Engineering. Most respected firm in the Pacific Northwest. They can start next week. Marcus's phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Thompson, we represent Coleman and Fisher. We demand immediate return of all confidential materials and compensation for damages estimated at $2.5 million. Failure to comply will result in legal action. The threat had become reality. Marcus showed Rachel the message, watching her expression shift from exhaustion to determination. David Greenberg will handle this. We'll argue public interest exception that you retained the files to prevent harm. It's not a perfect defense, but it's what we have. Marcus pocketed his phone, calculating how long his savings would last against corporate lawyers billing $500 an hour. I should go. Pick up Skylar from school. Rachel stopped him with a hand on his arm. Marcus, whatever happens with Coleman and Fisher, you did the right thing. Don't let them make you doubt that. He left Bennett and Warner with those words echoing in his mind, drove to Bridgeport Elementary in a daze of adrenaline crash and moral exhaustion. Skylar emerged from school looking lighter than she had that morning, and Marcus felt grateful that at least one of them had experienced a good day. How'd it go, Dad? Marcus navigated out of the parent pickup line, considering how much truth a 10-year-old could handle. I told them the truth. Now we wait to see if telling the truth was enough. Skylar seemed satisfied with that answer, launching into stories about her day, about Emma Richardson actually apologizing about the science project Mrs. Adams had assigned. Marcus listened, grateful for the normalcy of elementary school drama, for the reminder that life continued even as his own threatened to implode. They stopped for groceries, made dinner together, fell into the evening routine that had sustained them through 7 years. But as Skylar headed to bed, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, a certified email from Coleman and Fisher's legal department. Formal notification of lawsuit. $2.5 million in damages. Court date set for 6 weeks out. Marcus stared at the email, at the numbers that exceeded everything he owned by orders of magnitude, and felt the full weight of his choice settling onto shoulders that suddenly felt too narrow to bear it. He wanted to call Rachel to demand reassurance that her promise to cover legal fees wasn't empty corporate speak. But it was 10 p.m. and Skylar was calling from her room, another nightmare, keeping sleep at bay. Marcus went to his daughter, sat beside her bed, let her describe the bad dream until words ran out and exhaustion took over. He stayed there long after she fell asleep, watching her breathe, thinking about the families who would make the same choice he had, prioritizing children over everything else. Those families deserved to know what they were buying, even if knowing cost Marcus everything he had. Sunday disappeared into legal research that circled the same conclusion: he'd violated his NDA, and no amount of moral justification would change that fact. Marcus called in sick to Sullivan's for Monday, the first time in 7 years, needing space to process the legal threat and plan his next moves. Frank's response came immediately. Take what you need. Job will be here when you're ready. Marcus spent the morning researching public interest exceptions to NDAs, reading case law that offered hope in theory but little comfort in practice. Most cases settled before trial, corporate lawyers grinding down defendants until financial reality forced capitulation. He was 3 coffee cups into despair when his phone rang. Rachel Bennett calling from her office. The independent survey starts tomorrow. Geo-Pacific wants you on site. Your expertise could save them months of testing. The trap closed incrementally. Every hour consulting pulled him further from Sullivan's, deeper into the world he'd deliberately left behind. Rachel, I can't. I have commitments at the garage. Skylar needs consistency. Her voice held understanding mixed with urgency. One day. Just tomorrow. Help them understand the site's history, point them toward problem areas. After that, you're free. Skylar's words echoed, don't let them make you feel small. Frank's wisdom, you do what's right and accept the consequences. One day. Then I'm done. Rachel's relief came through clearly. Thank you. Geo-Pacific's lead engineer will contact you with details. Marcus hung up, caught between worlds that refused to stay separate. The past beckoned with expertise and purpose. The present demanded stability and presence. Monday arrived with routines that felt fragile, like glass held too tight. Marcus had taken the morning off from Sullivan's. Frank hadn't asked why, just waved him away with understanding that required no explanation. When Skylar burst through the door after school, backpack bulging with books and art supplies, Marcus welcomed the interruption from legal research that offered more despair than hope. "Dad, I need help with my science project." Marcus welcomed the distraction, following her to the kitchen table where she spread out papers covered in drawings. Buildings surrounded by trees, water features integrated with foundations, green roofs and solar panels, and designs that showed understanding beyond her years. "What's the project?" Skylar's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm she brought to things that mattered. "Ecosystems and sustainable environments. I'm designing a building that works with nature instead of against it." Marcus studied her drawings, seeing crude but conceptually sound approaches to environmental integration. The ideas weren't sophisticated, but the underlying principle was solid. "Where'd you learn this?" Skylar gave him a look that mixed innocence with knowing. "From you, Dad. I've seen your books. Sometimes I watch when you're on those architecture websites at night." Pride and exposure mixed in Marcus's chest. She'd been paying attention, absorbing knowledge he thought he'd hidden. "This is really good, Sky. Really thoughtful." She beamed under the praise, then her expression shifted to something more serious. "Dad, the kids at school say buildings can't help the environment. They say buildings always hurt nature. Is that true?" Marcus thought about the Riverview site, about contamination and damage, and the long legacy of construction that prioritized profit over ecology. Most buildings do hurt nature, but they don't have to. If you design thoughtfully, if you understand the land and work with it instead of against it, buildings can actually help. Skylar's next question came quietly. "Like how?" Marcus pulled out paper, started sketching. Plants that absorbed toxins, water systems that filtered naturally, foundations designed around existing ecosystems rather than destroying them. Skylar watched, absorbing, asking questions that showed she understood more than most adults about the relationship between human construction and natural systems. They worked together until dinner, Marcus rediscovering joy he'd forgotten existed. This was what he'd given up architecture for, moments like these, teaching his daughter, being present for questions that mattered. After Skylar went to bed, Marcus returned to the kitchen table to her drawings and his sketches. Something nagged at his mind, a connection he couldn't quite grasp. The Riverview site, contaminated soil, expensive remediation. The project halted because cleaning the land cost more than the development would generate. But what if cleaning the land was the development? Marcus pulled out his laptop, searching for information on phytoremediation using plants to absorb toxins from soil. The research was established, proven, but rarely deployed at large scale because it took decades to complete. Decades to clean soil. But if the development was designed around the cleaning process, if the contamination became a feature rather than a problem, Marcus started sketching in earnest, now buildings positioned around a central wetland, where the worst contamination concentrated. Specific plants, willows, poplars, native grasses selected for their ability to absorb heavy metals. The toxic pit transformed into an educational feature, a living demonstration of environmental restoration. The idea felt impossible and perfect simultaneously. Too innovative for conservative developers, too risky for cautious investors, but potentially transformative. Marcus worked through the night sketching, calculating, researching. By dawn, he had the outline of a concept that could save the Riverview project while healing the land it was built on. A concept inspired by his 10-year-old daughter's simple question: "How can buildings help nature?" Marcus texted Rachel at 6 a.m. "I think I have a solution. Can we meet?" Her response came within minutes. "My office, 7 a.m. Bring coffee." Marcus showered, dressed, stopped at the coffee shop Skylar liked, and drove downtown with a portfolio of sketches that might change everything or prove he'd lost perspective entirely. Rachel met him in her office, looking like she'd pulled an all-nighter herself. She took the coffee, gratefully gestured him toward the drafting table near the window. "Show me." Marcus spread out his sketches, explaining the concept, while Rachel listened with the focused intensity that characterized her approach to everything. When he finished, silence stretched for long seconds. Then Rachel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "This is brilliant. Completely unprecedented, probably impossible to fund, and absolutely brilliant." Relief and uncertainty mixed in Marcus's chest. It's just a concept. Would need serious engineering, environmental studies, probably years of permitting. Rachel was already pulling out her phone, texting someone. "I'm calling an emergency team meeting. If we're going to pitch this to the board, we need it fully developed. Can you stay?" Marcus thought about Sullivan's, about Frank covering for him yesterday, about promises made and responsibilities held. But this might actually work. "I'll stay." Rachel's team assembled within the hour. 3 architects Marcus didn't recognize, 2 engineers who looked fresh out of graduate programs, and Dr. Catherine Brennan, an environmental specialist whose credentials filled half a wall in published research. Marcus spread his sketches across the conference table, aware that his rough drawings looked amateurish compared to the CAD renderings these professionals worked with daily. But the concept underneath transcended presentation quality. The contamination isn't the problem, it's the solution. Tom Rivera, lead architect with 15 years at prestigious firms, leaned back with visible skepticism. "You want to design around a toxic waste pit? That's insane." Marcus kept his voice steady, refusing to be defensive. "I want to transform it. The worst contamination concentrates in an 80-foot radius near the old discharge pipes. Instead of excavating at massive cost, we contain it. Build a wetland system with plants specifically selected to absorb heavy metals over time." Dr. Brennan moved closer, studying the sketches with narrowed eyes. "Phytoremediation at this scale hasn't been attempted in urban development. The timeline alone would be 20 years minimum." Marcus nodded, expecting this resistance. "Right. But we're not hiding it. We make it the centerpiece, educational facilities showing environmental restoration in real time. The contamination becomes a feature demonstrating how development can heal rather than harm." Mike Johnson, the senior engineer, crossed his arms. "Who's going to buy a condo next to a toxic cleanup site? You're asking families to live beside poison." Rachel, who'd been quiet until now, stepped forward. "Families who want to be part of the solution. Portland millennials will pay premium prices for developments with proven environmental commitment. We market this as the first regenerative urban project in the Pacific Northwest." Tom shook his head. "It's never been done at this scale. Too risky. Too experimental." Marcus pulled out additional sketches showing building placement. "The residential units sit on verified clean soil. 100-foot buffer from the remediation zone. We monitor groundwater continuously, publish results quarterly. Complete transparency." Dr. Brennan traced the wetland boundaries with one finger. "The plant selection would be critical. Willows for chromium absorption, poplars for general heavy metals, specific native grasses for lead. We'd need constant monitoring, replacement cycles, soil testing every 6 months. Her voice shifted from skepticism toward professional interest. "This could actually work. Expensive as hell to maintain, but theoretically sound." The engineers huddled over calculations, arguing about drainage systems and groundwater flow patterns. The architects debated building orientations and sight lines. What had started as resistance was transforming into problem-solving. Rachel caught Marcus's eye, nodding approval. He'd won them over not through authority, but through an idea solid enough to survive professional scrutiny. By noon, the concept had evolved beyond Marcus's rough sketches into something approaching viability. The team identified challenges, permitting nightmares, construction timeline extensions, monitoring costs that would span decades. But underneath the obstacles lay possibility. Tom finally straightened, exhaustion and excitement mixing in his expression. We'll need full environmental impact assessments, structural engineering for the wetland containment, botanical consultants for plant selection. This becomes a 20-year project minimum. Rachel pulled out her phone, already moving to action. Then we build for 20 years, better than abandoning the site entirely. She looked at Marcus with something approaching gratitude. Where did this idea come from? Marcus thought about Skylar's drawings, her simple question about buildings helping nature. My daughter. Her science project asked how construction could work with ecosystems instead of destroying them. Sometimes the best solutions come from people who haven't learned all the reasons why things can't work. The team continued refining details, but Marcus felt the pull of other obligations. He'd promised one day. That day was ending. I need to leave. Pick up Skylar from school. Rachel walked him to the elevator. We're going to need you for this. Not full-time, but consistent consultation. The team needs someone who understands both the original contamination and this new approach. Marcus felt the trap of competence, the way expertise created obligation. I can't commit to more than this. I have responsibilities. Rachel's expression softened. What if we structured it differently, 1 day per week? You set the schedule work around Skylar's needs, the rest you do from home or not at all. The offer was reasonable, carefully designed to circumvent his objections. I'll think about it. The elevator arrived. Marcus stepped in, turned to face Rachel. Thank you for listening, for not dismissing the idea because it came from someone in flannel. Rachel's smile held genuine warmth. Thank you for reminding me why I built this company. It wasn't to maximize profit. It was to do development right, even when right is hard. The doors closed on her standing in the hallway, and Marcus descended through 18 floors thinking about choices that kept getting more complicated the more he tried to simplify them. Skylar bounded into the truck with energy that suggested a good day chattering about Emma Richardson actually being nice about the science project getting praise from Mrs. Adams. Marcus listened, grateful for normalcy that balanced the surreal quality of his morning. Over dinner, Skylar showed him refinements to her ecosystem drawings, and Marcus felt the strange loop of inspiration, his knowledge informing her. Her project informing his solution, the boundary between teaching and learning dissolving. Later, after Skylar slept, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open to an email from David Greenberg Bennett and Warner's lawyer. The subject line read simply, Coleman and Fisher Settlement Proposal. Marcus opened it, reading legal language that translated to $50,000. Public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and permanent prohibition from working in architecture. $50,000 would cover his legal fees and leave enough for Skylar's college fund. The acknowledgement would sting, but not destroy him. The prohibition meant closing a door he'd already walked away from years ago. Except he hadn't walked away. He'd detoured, taken an alternate path that was now converging with the road he'd left behind. Marcus composed a response. Counteroffer. $50,000. No public acknowledgement. No prohibition on future work. The files were retained for public safety, not personal gain. I'll accept consequences for the NDA violation, but I won't let Coleman and Fisher pretend their survey didn't condemn that land. He hit send before second-guessing could stop him, then sat staring at the screen, wondering if principle was worth poverty. The next 6 weeks collapsed time into density that made individual days blur. Geopacific Engineering deployed to the Riverview site, drilling core samples and mapping contamination patterns that matched Marcus's 7-year-old survey with disturbing precision. Dr. Caroline Wells, their lead engineer, called twice daily with technical questions that only someone who'd lived on that land could answer. Marcus maintained his schedule at Sullivan's 2 days weekly. The garage, his anchor when consulting, threatened to consume everything. Frank watched the transformation without comment, understanding written in the extra coffee he'd brew on mornings. Marcus arrived looking hollowed by sleepless nights. The renewal at Riverview project, Rachel had insisted on the name, her optimism a counterweight to Marcus's pragmatic caution, evolved from concept to detailed engineering plans. The team worked with the focused intensity of people building something unprecedented, aware that failure would validate every skeptic who'd dismissed phytoremediation as theoretical fantasy. Derek resigned quietly, the board approving a medical package that would cover treatment for him and Margaret. Marcus saw him once more at a coffee shop where Derek had requested a meeting that felt more like confession than closure. Derek looked better. The desperate edge had softened, replaced by something resembling peace. "I wanted to apologize for the bribery attempt, for the threats, for putting profits ahead of people's safety." Marcus accepted the apology without making it easy. "You were desperate. Doesn't excuse it, but I understand it." Derek's hands wrapped around his coffee cup, steady now. "The money from selling my shares will cover Margaret's care and my treatment. We're going to be okay. Better than I deserve." They sat in silence, two men who'd been adversaries finding common ground in the aftermath of conflict. Derek finally spoke again. "You did the right thing, Marcus. Even when it was hard, even when it meant ending my career. That takes integrity most people don't have." After Derek left, Marcus sat alone with the bitter knowledge that doing right rarely felt triumphant. Moral victories carried costs that complicated celebration. That evening alone in the house on Oak Street, Marcus allowed himself to think about Rachel's growing presence in his life. The way she'd looked at him during the board meeting, eyes holding something beyond professional respect. The hand on his arm that lingered a second too long. The phone calls that stretched past business into territory that felt dangerously personal. He'd sworn off complications after Lauren left, sworn to keep life simple, focused, predictable. Rachel Bennett was none of those things. She was intensity wrapped in tailored suits, ambition that matched his own. Someone who understood sacrifice because she'd built an empire on it. But she was also honest, competent. Someone who understood that Skylar came first not as concession, but as principle worth respecting. Maybe that was enough. Or maybe he was rationalizing because loneliness had become a habit he was tired of maintaining. The question could wait. Unlike contaminated soil, some things didn't require immediate remediation. Coleman and Fisher accepted his counteroffer 3 days before the court date. 50,000, no acknowledgement, no prohibition. Marcus signed the settlement with hands that shook slightly, watching 7 years of legal vulnerability dissolve into resolved history that Rachel had made possible. 2 weeks later, Rachel convened the meeting that would determine whether renewal at Riverview lived or died. Marcus arrived early wearing slacks and a button-down that Skylar had helped him iron. She'd been practicing for a presentation at school, approaching it with the seriousness she brought to everything that mattered. "Dad, remember you know more than they do. Don't let them make you nervous." Her advice echoed in his mind as he entered the conference room where 40 people waited. Investors in expensive suits, pre-sale buyers angry about delays, city officials whose approval was required, journalists whose coverage would shape public perception. Rachel stood at the front, composed, despite the pressure radiating from the assembled crowd. She caught Marcus's eye, nodding him toward a seat beside her presentation materials. The room settled as Rachel began. 6 weeks ago, we discovered that the Riverview site had contamination far worse than initial surveys indicated. We had a choice: abandon the project or reimagine it. We chose reimagination. She clicked to renderings that Marcus's team had developed, 3-dimensional models showing buildings arranged around a central wetland green space flowing between residential units. Renewal at Riverview isn't just development. It's the first regenerative urban project in North America. We're not hiding from contamination, we're healing it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Carl Morrison, a major investor who'd put in $8 million, stood abruptly. "You're asking us to invest in a toxic waste dump." Rachel didn't flinch. "We're asking you to invest in the future. This isn't cleaning up the past and building over it. This is showing how development can heal land while creating homes. Marcus watched Carl's face, reading skepticism that bordered on hostility. That's marketing speak. Will people actually buy these units? Rachel gestured toward Marcus. Marcus Thompson, our chief sustainability consultant and the architect who originally surveyed this site, can address that. Marcus stood feeling 40 pairs of eyes assess him. The flannel might be gone, but the oil under his fingernails remained permanent marks of 7 years doing work these people would never respect. We conducted market research. 72% of Portland millennials would pay premium prices for developments with proven environmental commitment. This isn't theoretical restoration. This is visible, measurable healing that residents can watch unfold over decades. Amanda Caldwell, a teacher who'd put $50,000 down on a condo, raised her hand. I bought into the original project. Now you're telling me I'll be living next to contamination. Marcus met her eyes directly. No. The contamination was always there. The original plan would have built directly on it. Your foundation would have cracked within 5 years. This plan puts residential units on verified clean soil with a 100-foot buffer from the remediation zone. Amanda's expression shifted from anger toward uncertainty. How do I know that's true? Marcus pulled out the original Coleman and Fisher survey, holding it up. Because I was the architect who surveyed this land 7 years ago. I know every square foot. And I'm telling you, the original plan was dangerous. This plan is safe. I have a 10-year-old daughter. I wouldn't let her live here if I didn't believe that completely. A man in the back stood, real estate investor with the weathered skepticism of someone who'd seen too many deals go south. Mr. Thompson, you're asking us to trust your judgment. But mechanics don't typically consult on $450 million developments. What makes you qualified? Marcus didn't flinch. 7 years ago, I chose my daughter over my career. That makes me qualified to understand what these families are choosing when they buy here. They're choosing their children's future. I won't let them choose wrong because I was too afraid to speak up. The room stayed quiet, but the quality of silence shifted. From hostile to considering. From skeptical to cautiously willing to believe. Commissioner Bradley, a city official whose approval was required, leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, you're staking your professional reputation on this. Marcus felt the weight of that question, understanding what it meant. Yes, and my personal reputation. Everything I am says, this is the right way to develop this land. Commissioner Bradley studied him for a long moment. That level of certainty is rare in this business. Most developers hedge, protect themselves with qualifiers. You're not hedging. Marcus shook his head. I can't. Too many families are trusting us to get this right. Rachel took over, walking through financial projections, construction timelines, monitoring protocols. The presentation lasted 90 minutes, and by the end, the room's energy had transformed from hostile to cautiously optimistic. When voting time arrived, 80% of original buyers chose to stay with revised plans. New investors committed $200 million. The city approved pending final environmental permits. Renewal at Riverview would proceed. As the room cleared, Amanda Caldwell approached Marcus. Thank you for caring enough to speak up even when it wasn't your problem. Marcus accepted her gratitude uncomfortably, still processing the implications of what he'd just committed to. Rachel found him in the hallway afterward, exhaustion and triumph mixing in her expression. We did it! Marcus felt the weight of we, the way partnership had formed without conscious decision. You did it. I just pointed out problems. Rachel's laugh came out tired but genuine. You provided solutions. There's a difference. She pulled out her phone, showing him a text from John Hastings. The board wants to formalize your role. Director of Sustainable Development. 1 day per week on-site rest as needed from home. The title felt too large, too official, too much like returning to a world he'd deliberately left. Rachel, I can't. I have, Skylar, I know, which is why it's 1 day weekly, your schedule, your terms. Marcus started to protest, but Rachel raised a hand. Before you refuse, understand what this means. Other developers are watching. If renewal succeeds, it changes how brownfield sites get developed across the country. You'd be shaping policy, creating precedent, doing work that actually matters beyond quarterly profits. The appeal to purpose hit harder than salary or prestige could have. Marcus thought about Skylar's question, how can buildings help nature? And realized answering it required more than sketches at a kitchen table. One day weekly, I pick the day, and I keep working at Sullivan's. Rachel extended her hand. Deal. They shook, sealing an agreement that felt heavier than employment, more like covenant. Marcus drove home thinking about trajectories, about how lives that seemed fixed could pivot on single decisions about the distance between who you were and who you might become. Skylar met him at the door, backpack already packed for the weekend visit to her grandmother's. Lauren's mother had maintained contact despite her daughter's abandonment, providing Skylar with family connection Marcus couldn't offer alone. How'd it go, Dad? Marcus knelt, meeting her at eye level. Good, really good. The project's moving forward. Skylar's smile carried pride that made his chest tighten. Because of your idea, Marcus pulled her close. Because of our idea. You asked the right question. I just worked out the details. After Skylar left with her grandmother, Marcus found himself alone in a house that felt simultaneously too quiet and too full of possibility. He moved to the spare room to the drafting table that had sat covered for 7 years. The sheet came off easily, revealing tools that had waited patiently for his return. Marcus pulled out fresh paper, began sketching not buildings, but timelines mapping the 20-year arc of Renewal's phytoremediation process against Skylar's growth from 10 to 30. By the time she graduated college, the wetland would be half cleaned. By the time she had her own children, the site would be approaching full restoration. The work Marcus was committing to extended beyond his own lifetime, planting seeds for harvests he'd never see. The thought should have felt overwhelming. Instead, it settled into his bones like certainty. This was work worth doing. 2 weeks later, Marcus received a call that shattered the fragile balance he'd been building. Principal Davis from Bridgeport Elementary, voice carrying professional concern. Mr. Thompson, there's been an incident. Skylar pushed Emma Richardson. I need you to come in immediately. Marcus left Sullivan's mid-repair, Frank waving him off without questions. The drive to school felt endless, mind racing through possibilities. Skylar didn't fight, didn't push. Something had broken through her usual resilience. Principal Davis met him in the office, Skylar sitting in a chair with tear-stained cheeks and defiant eyes. Emma said something about you being a sellout mechanic who pretends to be important. Skylar pushed her. Emma fell and skinned her knee. I'm suspending Skylar for 2 days. Anger built in Marcus's chest, but he directed it carefully. What consequences does Emma face for the verbal harassment that prompted the push? Principal Davis shifted uncomfortably. We're addressing that separately. But physical violence, Marcus kept his voice level. Understood. We'll take the suspension. But I want documentation that Emma's comments about me, about my profession, about my daughter's family situation constitute bullying under district policy. He signed the necessary papers, led Skylar to the truck in silence. Only after they were driving did he speak. Want to tell me what happened? Skylar's voice came out small, ashamed. She kept saying you were fake, that you're just a mechanic pretending to be an architect to get attention, that you're making everything up for money. Marcus pulled into their driveway, turned off the engine. And you believed her? Skylar shook her head violently. No, but everyone else did. They were all laughing, and I just wanted them to stop. Marcus understood then. This wasn't about defending him. It was about defending herself against mockery she couldn't escape. Sky people are going to say things. About me, about us, about choices we've made. You can't push everyone who questions us. Skylar's tears came harder now. But it's not fair. You're doing important work. You're helping people. Why do they have to be so mean? Marcus pulled her close, feeling her shake with frustration and hurt. Because people are afraid of things they don't understand. A mechanic who's also an architect doesn't fit their categories. It makes them uncomfortable, so they attack it. They sat in the truck for a long time, Marcus holding his daughter while she processed emotions too large for 10-year-old frameworks. Finally, Skylar pulled back. Can we go home? Inside, Marcus made hot chocolate the way Skylar liked it, too much marshmallow, not enough milk. They sat at the kitchen table, and the silence felt less comfortable than necessary. I'm not sorry I defended you, Skylar said quietly. But I'm sorry I pushed her. Marcus's chest tightened. I don't need defending, sweetheart. What people think about me doesn't change who I am. Just like what Emma says about you doesn't change who you are. Skylar's fingers traced patterns on her mug. But it hurts when they laugh. I know. Marcus reached across the table, covering her small hand with his. It hurts me too. But you know what hurts more? The thought that you'd compromise who you are to make the laughing stop. Don't ever do that, Sky. Not for them, not even for me. Skylar looked up, eyes red-rimmed but clearer. Is that why you keep working at the garage, even though you could just be an architect again? The question cut to bone. Part of it. But mostly I work at the garage because I chose you and I keep choosing you. Every day. The project is important, but you're more important. Skylar was quiet for a long moment. Dad, I don't want you to choose between the project and me. I know it's important. I know families need you to get it right. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His 10-year-old daughter was trying to give him permission to prioritize work over her, internalizing the message that his expertise mattered more than his presence. No. The word came out harder than intended. Marcus softened his tone. Never. You come first. Always. The project, the investors, the families, they're important. But you're more important than all of them combined. Skylar looked at him with eyes that had seen too much adult complexity. But if you quit, who helps them? Marcus didn't have an easy answer. The question exposed the fundamental tension he'd been avoiding: how to serve both responsibilities when serving one meant shortchanging the other. That night after Skylar was asleep, Marcus sat with his laptop open to an email he'd drafted to Rachel 3 times without sending. Each version said the same thing. I'm stepping back from renewal, focusing on what matters most. But his finger wouldn't click send, because Skylar was right. If he stepped back, who would ensure the remediation was done properly? Who would fight for families buying homes on healing land? The phone rang. Rachel calling late, which meant urgency. Marcus, we have a problem. Dr. Brennan found something during the latest core sampling. Another waste pit larger than the first. Right where we planned the eastern building cluster. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the project's complexity expanding beyond manageable boundaries. How large? Rachel's voice carried the strain of someone bearing too much weight. 100 feet wide, 40 feet deep. Filled with industrial solvents from the 1960s. If we excavate, it'll cost another $50 million. If we don't, we can't build there. The silence stretched while Marcus processed implications. $50 million meant delayed construction, angry investors, possible project collapse. Give me 24 hours, I might have an idea. He hung up, pulled out Skylar's science drawings, studied them with new eyes. Her simple sketches showed buildings working with nature problems transformed into features. What if they didn't excavate the second pit? What if they made it the heart of the entire development? Marcus worked through the night sketching a revised plan where both contamination zones became integrated. Wetlands connected by walking paths and educational installations. The development would wrap around healing rather than hiding from it. By morning, he had something to show Rachel, but he also had a daughter who needed reassurance that she mattered more than any project. Marcus made breakfast, sat across from Skylar at their kitchen table. I need to tell you something. The work I'm doing, it's important, but you're more important. If this job ever makes you feel like you're second, you tell me immediately. Skylar picked at her pancakes. But the families, Marcus interrupted gently. The families will be fine. Rachel has a whole team, but you only have one father, and I chose you once before. I'll choose you again if I have to. Skylar's eyes filled with tears, but different ones than yesterday's anger. I don't want you to have to choose. I want you to do both. Marcus reached across the table, taking her hand. Then help me figure out how. Because I don't know the answer, Sky. I'm making this up as I go. They sat together in morning light, father and daughter, trying to navigate complexity that shouldn't fall on 10-year-old shoulders, but somehow had anyway. Later, Marcus drove to Rachel's office with his revised plans and a proposal. Rachel studied the new drawings, understanding dawning in her expression. You want to make both pits the centerpiece, Marcus nodded. Skylar's science project. She showed me that problems don't have to be hidden. They can be features if you design around them honestly. Rachel walked to her window, looking out at Portland's skyline. This changes everything. Instead of 400 units, we're down to 300. Revenue drops by 100 million. She turned back and her eyes held determination. But it's right. It's what this project should be: complete honesty about contamination and complete commitment to healing it. Relief mixed with apprehension in Marcus's chest. The investors won't like it. Rachel's smile carried steel underneath. They'll like lawsuits less. We present this as the only viable option, and they'll accept it. She walked Marcus through logistics timeline adjustments, permit requirements. An hour later, he left her office with a revised contract that formalized his role while explicitly limiting his hours. 1 day weekly, on site. Rest as needed from home. Skylar's schedule takes priority over all meetings. Rachel had put it in writing, protected his boundaries before he'd thought to ask. Marcus drove to Sullivan's, found Frank working on a transmission rebuild that had defeated 2 other mechanics. You look like a man who's made a decision. Marcus grabbed his coveralls. Taking the consulting position. 1 day a week. Rest of the time I'm here. Frank grunted approval, the closest he came to enthusiasm. Good. Place was getting boring without you stirring up trouble. They worked side by side, Marcus losing himself in mechanical problems with clear solutions, grateful for work that didn't require navigating moral complexity or balancing competing obligations. That evening, Marcus took Skylar to the Riverview site for the first time. They stood at the fence line looking at land that would transform over the next 20 years. See that area with the orange markers? That's where the worst contamination is. We're going to plant willows there, special ones that absorb heavy metals through their roots. Skylar studied the site with the focus she brought to things that mattered. Will it really work? Marcus thought about timelines measured in decades, about healing that outlasted individual lifetimes. It'll work. Slowly. By the time you're my age, this land will be clean. Your kids might play here in a park built on healing. Skylar's hand found his. That's a long time to wait. Marcus squeezed her fingers gently. The best things usually are. 3 months later, Marcus stood on a temporary platform at the Riverview site, surrounded by 200 people gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony. Investors in suits, buyers in casual clothes, city officials, journalists, curious neighbors. Commissioner Bradley spoke first, praising Bennett and Warner's innovative approach. John Hastings followed, framing renewal as Portland's contribution to sustainable development. Then Rachel introduced Marcus, and he felt the weight of attention shift. Marcus Thompson represents everything this project stands for. 7 years ago, he chose his daughter over his career. Today, he's showing us that sometimes the paths we leave lead back to where we're meant to be, just differently than we expected. Marcus stepped to the microphone, acutely aware of Skylar watching from the front row of the families whose homes would rise on this healing land of the 20-year timeline stretching ahead. I'm not good at speeches. I'm better with blueprints and soil samples. But I want you to understand what you're part of. This isn't just development. This is patience. This is choosing to do things right, even when right takes decades. His voice carried across the assembled crowd. Buildings should last, but more than that, they should heal. The land beneath our feet was poisoned by people who didn't think about consequences beyond their own lifetimes. We're reversing that. Planting trees we'll never see fully grown. Cleaning soil that will benefit people we'll never meet. Marcus paused, finding Skylar's eyes. My daughter asked me once how buildings can help nature. This is the answer. By being honest about damage. By committing to restoration. By accepting that some work takes longer than one lifetime and doing it anyway. The ceremony concluded with golden shovels photographs, champagne for adults, and sparkling cider for children. Marcus lifted Skylar so she could help break ground, her small hands wrapped around the shovel alongside his and Rachel's. The symbolic gesture completed, Marcus set Skylar down and stepped back from the platform. Amanda Caldwell approached the teacher who'd questioned him months earlier. Thank you. For fighting for this. For making sure we knew what we were buying. Others followed, offering gratitude that made Marcus uncomfortable. He'd done what needed doing, nothing more. Rachel found him at the edge of the crowd, both of them watching bulldozers position for actual excavation that would begin Monday. We did it. Marcus shook his head. We started it. The real work takes 20 years. Rachel's hand found his fingers intertwining with a naturalness that suggested the gesture had been building for months. Then we build for 20 years. The work unfolded in the methodical way of all lasting things. 3 months after groundbreaking, the first residential building topped out its frame, a promise against Portland sky. The phytoremediation wetlands established root systems, willows drinking contamination through specialized cells evolved over millennia to transform poison into growth. Frank Sullivan retired on his 72nd birthday, selling the garage to Marcus at terms that felt more inheritance than transaction. Marcus Thompson, Auto and Consulting. The hybrid name confused customers but fit the life he'd built from pieces of everything he'd been. Marcus maintained his rhythm 2 days beneath car frames one day, among blueprints weekends with Skylar, watching her absorb the world with the same intensity she'd brought to a science project that had changed everything. Skylar's ecosystem design won district competition. The trophy sat on her shelf beside drawings that had inspired a $450 million development proof that questions asked by 10-year-olds sometimes opened doors that adults had learned to keep closed. Emma Richardson's father had lost his development firm to bankruptcy karma, Marcus thought, but didn't say, and the experience had cracked the girl's cruelty like a shell breaking from inside. She'd apologized to Skylar 3 times before Skylar accepted. Their friendship remained cautious, built on wariness, earned through pain. But it was real. Rachel integrated slowly, respecting boundaries Marcus had drawn in permanent ink around Skylar's schedule. Tuesday dinners that became tradition. Occasional Saturday mornings at the construction site where Skylar asked questions that made engineers rethink assumptions. Presence that enhanced rather than invaded, built on patience that Marcus recognized because he was learning to practice it himself. On a Saturday in March, Marcus brought Skylar to the Riverview site to witness progress. The first residential building stood complete, now its facade reflecting sky and water in glass that had been cleaned of the metaphorical dirt beneath. Below, the wetland land showed early signs of success. Plants establishing water quality improving by measurable increments, contamination levels beginning their slow decline toward safety. Skylar studied it all with the focus she brought to things that mattered. It's really happening. Our idea is real, Marcus corrected gently as he always did. Your question, my answer. But yes, Sky, it's real. They walked the perimeter, Marcus explaining construction timelines, remediation protocols, the monitoring systems that would track progress for decades. Skylar absorbed it all, asking questions that showed understanding beyond her years. but rooted in curiosity that remained beautifully appropriately young. At the wetland's edge, they found a plaque recently installed. Bronze permanent carrying words Rachel had insisted on despite Marcus's objections to anything resembling recognition. Renewal at Riverview, built on the principle that foundations aren't just about buildings, they're about what we choose to stand on. Below that smaller text, inspired by the question, "How can buildings help nature?" asked by Skylar Thompson, age 10. Skylar read it 3 times, eyes widening with each pass. "Dad, my name is on it. Forever." Marcus knelt beside her. "Your idea deserved recognition. Decades from now, when this land is fully healed, people will know." It started with a 10-year-old asking the right question at the right time. They stood together in spring sunshine, looking at land transforming from wound to healing, from problem to solution, from contamination to restoration, measured in timelines that exceeded single lifetimes. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Frank's daughter, who'd taken over communication since her father's retirement, slowed his thumb typing to frustration. "Dad wants to know if you're coming to his birthday party next week. Says to bring that CEO lady who knows good coffee." Marcus smiled, typing confirmation. His life had become a web of connections he'd never anticipated, relationships built through conflict and collaboration. Family extending beyond blood to include people who'd witnessed transformation and stayed through complications. That evening, Rachel joined them for dinner at the house on Oak Street. She'd learned to navigate the space without trying to change it, accepting the peeling paint and worn furniture as evidence of priorities that went deeper than aesthetics, recognizing that some foundations couldn't be renovated without destroying what made them strong. After Skylar went to bed, Rachel and Marcus sat on the porch watching neighbors walk dogs and children play basketball in driveways. Ordinary lives that felt extraordinary in their persistence. "Chicago called again," Rachel said quietly. "They want to replicate renewal. Old factory site, similar contamination profile. They're offering to make me a partner." Marcus heard the question underneath the future being negotiated through words chosen carefully. "You want to go?" Rachel shook her head. "I want to see this through. 20 years. But they'll keep asking, and eventually saying yes might make sense. Other cities need this. Other sites need healing." Marcus thought about expansion, about success creating opportunity, about how doing something well meant being asked to do it again. "Then we figure it out together," he said. "If that's what you want." Rachel's hand found his. "I want to know if we is something we're building or something I'm imagining, because I've been alone for so long, I've forgotten how partnership actually works." The question deserved honesty. Marcus had been avoiding comfortable in ambiguity that asked nothing and risked less. "I've been alone for 7 years, he said slowly. "Chose it. Built my life around it. Skylar was enough, the garage was enough, and I convinced myself that wanting more was selfishness I couldn't afford." Rachel waited patient in the way she'd learned to be with him. "But you're not asking me to choose between you and her. You're asking if there's room for both. And I think—" He paused, finding certainty. "I think there is. If we build it right, slowly. With foundations that can hold weight, we add carefully." Rachel leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in silence that held more than words ever could, watching Portland's night settle over a neighborhood where paint peeled and lawns grew wild, but families stayed and children learned that home wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing to build something worth maintaining. 20 years, Rachel said eventually. "That's how long renewal takes. Think we can build something that lasts that long." Marcus thought about willows absorbing chromium, about soil healing molecule by molecule, about work that extended beyond lifetimes and required faith that effort today mattered to people tomorrow who'd never know your name. I think the best things take that long, he said. And I think we're both stubborn enough to see it through. Rachel's fingers tightened around his. Then let's build for 20 years. See what we create. They stayed there as stars emerged invisible through Portland's light pollution. Two people learning to trust that sometimes the best foundations require decades of patient work, careful attention to what held them up, and acceptance that some structures took longer than one lifetime but mattered more because of it. Marcus squeezed Rachel's hand, feeling Skylar's presence sleeping inside Frank's wisdom, echoing in memory. Derek's redemption, proving that people could change the Riverview site healing slowly beneath stars that had watched the land long before humans poisoned it, and would watch long after humans healed what they'd broken. 7 years ago, Brad Hutchins had mocked him in a bar, dismissing the mechanic who'd just crawled out from under a car hood. That man had been right about what he'd seen. He'd just been wrong about what it meant. Some foundations took decades to build properly. Some required breaking before they could be remade stronger. Some questions, like Skylar's simple inquiry about buildings helping nature, opened doors to futures no one could predict, but everyone could choose to walk through. Marcus Thompson had walked through those doors carrying his daughter with him, building something that would outlast them both, proving that mechanics could be architects, and architects could be mechanics. And the space between those identities held room for lives lived fully honestly, with foundations strong enough to bear the weight of choices made for love rather than recognition. And that felt exactly right.